In the first installment of my new series, Comics to Movies, a series where I explore superhero movies and compare them to their source material, I will be reviewing The Shadow Strike from 1937. But first, a bit about the series. It will primarily focus on superhero properties and will discuss superhero films with previous material published. It is also important to note that this will only focus on material published before the movie I am analyzing and mostly be focused on the time period of the film released, or the story it adapts. I am also only reviewing films I deem as superhero. Thus why I skipped the Zorro films, as it predates the superhero boom and to me is too alienated from the genre to count. If you have noticed that I have missed a film or have incorrect info, please leave a comment so that I can rectify it in a later video. Finally, this will only focus on live action films, but TV films, serials, and any other theatrically released movie is fair game. The Shadow Strikes is a 1937 film directed by Lynn Shore starring Rod LaRocque as Lamont Cranston, aka The Shadow, and adapts the Shadow pulp stories and radio show that started in the middle of 1930. The film follows The Shadow mostly under the identity of Lamont Cranston as he attempts to solve the murder of one of his clients, Caleb Denthorn, who is shot while the two were talking about Delton's will. The suspect escapes and it quickly becomes a mystery with all of the members of the Delthorn family as suspects. Many red herrings are thrown in along the way. Winston Comstock, a man found by the police wandering near the house by police, and a nephew, Caleb Delthorn, is painted as the prime suspect but eventually is killed under suspicious circumstances, with Jaster Delthorn found near his corpse with a gun. He quickly becomes the prime suspect because this and his revelation that he gambles quite a bit and owes money to a group of racketeers led by Brosset. It is eventually revealed that these are the killers of Caleb. However, they found out the identity of the Shadow. This causes Brosset to attempt to assassinate the Shadow at his office, but before he can, Delthorn's butler Wellington comes in to kill the Shadow as he believes that he was the killer. Eventually Brosset comes inside, intent on murdering the Shadow, and gunfire erupts, both from Wellington and Brosset, and the two men were killed after this. Afterwards, the Shadow is hailed as a hero for solving the murder. Overall, this was a pretty good film from the golden age of cinema. Only running about an hour, it's quick and easy to watch. I felt like it could have been one of those mystery radio shows at the time, with its whodunit structure. It also picks up as if it was any other Shadow adventure, not bothering for a drawn-out explanation and origin. You just understand this man is the Shadow, and after a small bit of exposition in the first 5 minutes, you understand his motivation why he's the Shadow. Like many great radio shows of the time, the film allows the audience to gain clues with the Shadow as he unravels the mystery. Clues are often shown to the audience directly, so curious audience members can determine who they believe did it. And in the end, it didn't feel obvious, making it a satisfying conclusion to the film. Although this movie is structured much like an old radio show, it has impressive film techniques for the day. Like many of the films of the era, there was no music, which can take some emotion out of films. Imagine Star Wars without the music. However, this movie does not necessarily feel like it needs music, as it adds the old 30s mystery thriller type vibes evident in movies like the Universal Dracula starring Bela Lugosi. It also adds a real golden age of Hollywood vibe, which lends itself well to the material presented. The Shadow is also rarely shown in his disguise, which makes exposition easier to do and really pushes the film along. It also helps humanize the film more than we would have had from a faceless detective watching from the outside, and honestly also contributes to the feel of being a more standard mystery. However, with the Shadow scarcely in the movie, it seems odd that the title is The Shadow Strike, as he really does very little in the costume. So perhaps a name like The Shadow would have been more fitting, but again, it comes down a lot to the era, as many of the films and serials of the day had a sort of grand title. All in all, I enjoyed this film. It is a real different direction than we see in most modern superhero films, and it is interesting to see how superhero movies evolved, especially since many superheroes like Batman were heavily influenced on this character. Overall, I would suggest this film to people that are interested in the history of Batman and superhero fans in general. It is also a good film for people who enjoy old Hollywood or who are curious of films of the era. One more brief side note about Batman is the interesting similarities evident in this film. For example, the Shadow's assistant plays a role very similar to the one we'd see Alfred adapt later on, as he was established as Bruce Wayne's butler, driving the Shadow around, playing support, and ultimately being a character the Shadow confides in. Also, this film seems to be a lot like Bob Kane's early Bat work, so it might be interesting to watch the film and compare it to Bob Kane's early work on Detective Comics, namely Detective Comics 27 through 37. But the big question about this film is how does it stack up compared to the source material and Shadow's lore at the time? Interestingly, the Shadow began as a fictitious narrator for the Detective Story Hour in 1930. However, his popularity as part of the program began to grow, so they decided to make him a full character. So in 1931, Walter B. Gibson, under the name of Maxwell Grant, created the Shadow. He was creating 2 novel-length stories a month, based on his many exploits. In the pulps, it was established his name was Kent Allard, a French pilot during World War I who assumes the mantle of the Shadow to solve mysteries and fight crime. However, a man named Lamont Cranston, a wealthy playboy, was blackmailed by the Shadow to allow him to use his name as an alias. This would allow him to have a false identity well in New York. Eventually, the two began to team up and would often switch places when needed. I speculate that the reason the movie just used the Lamont Cranston name and why he became a lawyer in the film likely came down to simplicity, as it would have taken a fair amount of time to establish this character's multiple identities, and it made it much easier to insert him in the situation at the Delthorne household. It is also important to note that the Shadow had many other aliases, but they were less important and not featured in this film. Ironically, even though the movie relies so heavily on the human side of the Shadow, in the actual radio series he has no alias other than the Shadow. To make up for it, however, the radio show offered the explanation that the Shadow physically learned how to shadow himself from others so that he could not be seen. So essentially up to 1937, that was all that was known about the Shadow. I have a theory that this movie may have started as something different and then became the Shadow for marketing purposes, or perhaps the screenwriters just wanted to make something different, but it is likely that we will never know the true answer for that.